months I've noticed a few conversations and videos among spiritual circles talking about have humanity stumbled onto the wrong timeline. And some of these discussions or videos were maybe selling a little bit of panic and saying, oh yes, we're on the wrong timeline and this is what we've got to do to get back onto the right timeline. And people have been asking what's going on with Ascension. Personally, I absolutely disagree that we've somehow stumbled into the wrong place, and I think we're 100% on the right timeline, and if you stick with me, I'll explain why. I remember having a conversation a few years ago, probably about 4 or 5 years ago, with one of my more spiritual friends who was into stuff like Ascension. And I'd been doing a lot of research and I'd probably got myself a little bit nervous, and I'd said to him, you know, I'm a little bit worried. You know, I've been researching the NWO and various other plans that I can see playing out, and I'm getting a little bit scared, I've got to be honest. It seems to me that maybe the collective are going down a bit of a dark path here. And I remember him saying to me, look, don't worry about it, because when the time comes, we'll all just ascend. And I remember at the time just not feeling satisfied by that answer. At that time, I didn't really understand how Ascension would take place. And I know that I thought at the time, that just doesn't feel right to me. I don't think that's how it's going to happen. Then as everything's sort of been unraveling over the past year and we've been seeing a breakdown in a lot of different areas, I began to realize that I was noticing a pattern with what was happening, and that it was reminding me of something else that I'd gone through in my life that was quite significant, and that was a deep spiritual awakening. As above, so below, as within, so without, as they say. Now, if you break down sort of the stages of a deep spiritual awakening, I think you'll see what I mean. And obviously, spiritual awakening is a little bit different for everybody, but it tends to follow these particular stages. So first of all, there's usually a big, life-changing and painful event that takes place that shakes us awake, it shakes us out of the mundane, and it makes us realize the places that maybe we're not living in alignment, where maybe we're just going through the motions, we're not being fully authentic, or maybe we're going along with things that other people want just to keep the peace rather than being true to ourselves. This is often, it can be absolutely traumatic for some people, and I know it was for me. It was an absolute shake-up where, you know, I felt like I lost everything that mattered to me, and it was very, very difficult, and going through that phase is very confusing and you don't know what's going on. But if you give it time and you focus on your own personal growth, what you start to see is you become aware of a lot of illusion. You become aware of where you've felt deceived. So at this point, truth is being unveiled to you, and that's the key word, unveiled. So it's not that things are getting worse, it's that things are getting revealed, they're being unveiled. You have to understand that there's a lot of people right now that have had no context really to this current situation. They maybe haven't been researching, they haven't been going through awakening, and all of a sudden crisis has hit, and I think it sent a lot of people really scrambling for answers and feeling as though maybe nothing was as they thought it was. And obviously going through something like that is a really quite powerful existential crisis. There may be times during spiritual awakening that will violently oppose the changes that are going through us, and we'll really try and fight back, and we'll try and get back into that sense of normality and go back into our safe little box. But once you've been blown open, that never really works. You know, the only way to get out of it is to go through it. And in the early stages, it can be more painful than it is magical. So I think we're kind of in these stages right now. If you look at this as a collective awakening, we're in these very early stages where we're being shaken awake by some kind of trauma. We're now starting to see through the lies and deception. We're maybe starting to have a realization that the way we've been living as a collective has not really been serving us. But because we were maybe comfortable and our lives were working quite well, it can be really, really difficult to resonate the idea that nothing you've been believing in is the reality. So then we tend to go through something called a dark night of the soul. And right now, when you look around, you could almost say we're going through a dark night of the world. This is difficult, it's isolating. You feel very disconnected from the people around you. You're forced to face varied pain and to heal your wounds. And this can take time, and this part of awakening is different for everybody. We all have our own personal stuff to go through. If you look around at how everybody's been experiencing this situation this past year, although we've been kind of thrown into the same situation, and although we've sort of been forced almost onto the same timeline, everybody's been experiencing it completely different. Everybody's suffering a different type of loss. When you come through the dark night of the soul, it's very difficult to go back into a situation where you're maybe oppressed, or where you're not living truthfully and, you know, mostly true to yourself. So it becomes a lot more obvious. And obviously during this time as well, and I'm not going to go into this too much in this video, you might be going through kind of chakra openings, you're going through the Merkaba activation, you could be going through a lot of other things, but mostly you're just striving to make sense of everything. At this stage, generally, it's very hard to go back to anything that was holding you down and oppressing you. So for some people, that could be a job that, you know, you really just can't face it anymore. Once you start to awaken, it's no longer true to you. It maybe offends your soul, or it just drains your life force, and you can't go back in that direction. It could be a relationship, it could be a family member that, you know, you feel as though maybe they've been controlling, or they haven't been, again, true to you, and you feel like you really want to kind of break those ties. But around this stage, there can also be a temptation to spiritually bypass, to look for quick answers, to maybe put all of our focus onto a relationship and believe that that's the answer, or to fully throw ourselves into work as a means to take our mind off what's going on within. So it can go completely the other way, where we almost run more towards the things that aren't working for us is in an attempt to spiritually bypass. Or we can try and push the experience away completely and potentially slide backwards back into our comfort zones. But if you go through this in a healthy way and you commit yourself to the journey, it's more likely that you're going to start to bring up and deal with a lot of unhealed stuff, and you're going to get an opportunity to transmute any darkness that's there. And this might come through deep emotional release, through soul searching, and again through isolation. It might come through the acceptance and letting go of things that were hurting or harming you, things that you agreed to even though your soul knew it wasn't right on some level. I think you're probably starting to see the picture that I'm painting here of how, again, as above, so below. Everything that we've been going through spiritually, internally, is now playing out externally. And to me, this is the nature of ascension. Awakening is ascension. And okay, you're going to get a little bit further along that ascension path, and you're going to realize that you're suddenly developing some pretty cool gifts and that you've become multidimensional. But you never would have got to that point if you hadn't have gone through the difficulty and the struggle and the breaking open and the having to look at reality and look at what wasn't serving you first. So at this point, you may really start to understand your personal power. And although you feel love towards your fellow man and towards the people in your life, you no longer want to go along with things just for the sake of it or to have an easy life. You want to start living in a way that's really in soul alignment to who you truly are. Because awakening isn't about becoming someone else. It's about discovering who you've always been. It's not about trying to become better. It's about realizing that you've always been incredible. So now we get to a point where personal growth truly accelerates, and we're amazed by our own potential and what we can actually achieve and accomplish. And at this point, it generally doesn't need to be a fight against the old. You're just very much drawn towards the new and what works better for you. You're more interested in rebuilding something better than fighting with your old way of being. This is when deep transformation takes place. And at this point, if you've stayed deeply committed to the path that you're on, if you're doing the work, if you're meditating, if you're finding ways to keep clearing, keep activating, keep moving forward, you'll find that it becomes effortless. It just becomes your way of being. It becomes your way of life. And finally, on the road of deep spiritual awakening, we reach self-actualization. This is when the full potential of the human is released and embraced. This is when we have the confidence to really step into our light, to step into our power, and to maybe be a beacon for other people. So for me, it's not really a surprise that this is happening. And I definitely don't think that we're on the wrong timeline. And I don't think that the idea of ascension is gone by any means. In fact, I think that this has been my sign of all signs. I used to hear people talking about ascension years and years ago because I was always a spiritual person even before I went through my awakening. And although it was a nice theory, and I loved the idea of us reaching this new golden age for all people, not just a few, it always felt a little bit way out, like maybe a little bit new age, and I wasn't really sure if I believed it. And then I started to go through my own personal ascension, and I realized that, as I said, deep awakening is ascension. Get to a point where you realize you can literally feel it happening to you, and you're switching on all kinds of abilities. And I've sort of said doing the clearing a lot in this video, and because that is the key to ascension. You've got to think, if you have a population of people who are constantly being frightened by the news, and they're constantly being told what to think, and there's this never-ending bombardment of terror and anxiety, what kind of society is that population going to create? Look around you. If you're from a young child being taught to worship at the altar of authority, tricked into believing that they have to worship materialism and instant gratification or their most basic urges, taught to turn away from your natural instincts and go along with what society deems acceptable for you, what is that going to create? Now, if you took the same population and those people had been taught how to heal themselves, how to awaken spiritually, how to activate their third eye so that they couldn't be deceived, how to walk around with a fully functioning, open and activated heart chakra, where they could feel loving and compassionate towards other people as they could towards themselves or somebody that they loved, anyone, had their lower chakras balanced, so they had no real sense of scarcity, lack, or of sexual dysfunction. What kind of population would that create? Think about it. That's ascension. That's where we're going, and that's how this is going to happen. And this is the breakdown that's going to facilitate this. Now, I'm going to talk more about how ascension is facilitated, because this is drastically oversimplifying, but it still is very relevant. Really, all of this has been inevitable. It wasn't sustainable, and I know a lot of the non-Western world have sort of been watching and seeing this coming for quite a while. If you've travelled or if you talk to people from different cultures, you'll realise that none of this is particularly a shock to them. And so there's particular signs that a government is collapsing or that a society is collapsing. The first is economic. I'm sure that we can all see that. Next generally comes the commercial collapse. So if you look at kind of the big tech companies, we've seen one of the greatest digital migrations off of platforms like Twitter and Facebook due to the fact of censorship and this desperate attempt to keep control over what people are thinking and believing. Generally, there's then a cultural collapse, so the cultures and traditions that those people in that country have observed and celebrated, the normal day-to-day life that they live tends to break down. And of course there's the political collapse, where people start to realise that their leaders are not being honest. They again start to see through the deception and the lies. They're maybe turning away and looking to other places for truth and answers. And then maybe you might have some more obvious symptoms like control, possibly some elements of martial law. I think it's safe to say that we are witnessing collapse, and obviously with it being not just one country, but the entire West that's collapsing, that's pretty frightening for a lot of people. And I think it's trying to have sympathy for that, even if you've been awake for quite a long time and you were one of the people that saw something like this coming. You may not have known exactly what was going to happen, but you probably knew that we were on the verge of something very big and that it was going to be difficult. I saw a quote recently that said, "Nobody wants to be the last fool to finally get the picture." So for those people who are desperately clinging to the old belief systems, believe that they're in a lot of pain too. Maybe just as much as the people who know exactly what's been going on and have their eyes wide open. And remember that some people were gifted with awakening sooner so that they could be that support network and that pillar of strength for the people that maybe didn't know that something was coming and who weren't tapped in with their spiritual selves. And remember that this next stage is going to be where we have a real job to do, to step in and guide people and comfort people. A lot of people are going to be going through the classic stages of grief. They're going to be angry, they're going to be trying to bargain with themselves that, you know, if I just do what I'm told, if I just follow along, if I just keep my head down, things will go back to normal. You know, they may then be going through complete denial, grief over what they feel that they've lost. So these times are difficult for everyone, and it's always difficult in the early stages. It's always going to knock us for six. When it comes to things like ascension, it can be very difficult to talk about, but an idea seems preposterous until it's embraced by the collective and just becomes normal to everyone. And I think this is what we're going to be seeing over the next few years, and those who've been a bit more spiritually clued in are going to be helping to light the way for those who are in deep loss, panic, grief, and a whole range of emotions. And then we have our own stuff to go through too. And this is why it's really important right now to be the beauty in the breakdown. And you can do that by going inward. So no matter what's happening externally, remember what it was like for you when you were first cracked open, when you first became aware of the matrix, when you first became aware that we were living in a completely unsustainable paradigm. So remember, it's not getting worse, it's getting unveiled. And to me, this is what it was always going to take so that we could move forward. You can't build a beautiful house on rotten foundations. You have to bulldoze what was there previously before you can build something new. It takes time, it takes work, it doesn't happen overnight. But then when you finally built your beautiful new house, you know it was all worth it. I think the thing we have to be mindful of now is where we're setting our intentions and our focus, because obviously there's people out there in positions of power who know that this collapse is happening. Maybe they're allowing this to happen so that something new can be rebuilt on their terms. The reason that so many people are being led helplessly along in denial is because they've never been allowed to realize their own personal power. They've been living with this learned helplessness and this hopeless dependence on authority in the system. So they don't realize how wonderful it can be, and that the only true authority that you need is your higher self and your source creator. When you get deeply into ascension, it's going to take you to heights that you never dreamed of internally, and you're going to watch the external transform. But for now, we are witnessing people that are still in that terror, in that psychosis, in that fear, and in that belief that they have to try and control the external in order for them to be safe, which never works. In fact, it becomes a case of let go or be dragged. Do all that you can to shine a light of truth for people, but realize that for some people it is going to take time. And once the truth is out there, I always think of it like a dam, what's happening now. And I think about it as a dam with many cracks in it. And behind that dam is the water, which is the lies and the dysfunction and everything that has been kind of done to us, the betrayal. And every day that dam is cracking just a little bit more. And eventually there's going to be a hole so big that the dam's going to break. And so it can be very frustrating sometimes because you want people to just hurry up and see what's happening. But it's a process for every person. And eventually I do believe that we can completely shift the tides in our favour. And we do that through setting our intention, keeping our focus, on what we want to create rather than trying to fight the old. We've got to now lead by example and let people see that there's a better way, that you can get to a point where you're healed and whole and know your value and your power and know that you're worthy and that you're spectacular even. I'd like to leave you with an excerpt that I love from a book called Eat, Pray, Love by Elizabeth Gilbert. It goes like this. A friend took me to the most amazing place the other day. It's called the Augusteum. Octavian Augustus built it to house his remains. When the barbarians came, they trashed it along with everything else. The great Augustus, Rome's first great true emperor, how could he have imagined that Rome, the whole world as far as he was concerned, would be in ruins? It's one of the quietest, loneliest places in Rome. The city has grown up around it over the centuries. It feels like a precious wound, a heartbreak you won't let go of because it hurts too good. We all want things to stay the same, settle for living in misery because we're afraid of change, of things crumbling to ruins. Then I looked around to this place at the chaos it has endured, the way it's been adapted, burned, pillaged, and found a way to build itself back up again. And I was reassured. Maybe my life hasn't been so chaotic. It's just the world that is, and the real trap is getting attached to any of it. Ruin is a gift. Ruin is the road to transformation.